Okay, so would the real John Calvin stand up? And I'm going to start with John Calvin, This Is Your Life. Just a few basics about who he was and what he did. Calvin was born in 1509 on the 10th of July in Noyon in Picardy in the northeast of France. And he studied law mostly at Paris University and Orléans and Bourges further south in France. And at some time during his student years, he was converted. We don't know exactly when, but we do have his own account of it. He says that he was ensnared in papal superstition. He was particularly prone to that. And then he said, God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame. So this was a changing from Roman Catholic doctrine and superstition, and now suddenly being made teachable, as he saw it, by God. And he was a student at Paris, as I say, and he was associated with a slightly controversial sermon that was given in Paris beginning of October in 1533, and basically he had to leave town before the police got him. So he fled and went initially to southern areas of France where it was safer, and then when the persecution of Protestant ideas heightened, he left France and went to Basel in Switzerland. And there he thought he was ready for a quiet life of retirement. I don't mean retirement, sort of, drawing a pension, but quiet life of scholarly activity with no responsibilities. However, he was making a journey, and there was a traffic diversion that meant he had to go through Geneva, intending to spend one night there. And there was an older man, a Swiss preacher, Farel, who had brought the Reformation to Switzerland, and he heard that Calvin was in town. And he went to him and said, God is calling you to work here. And Calvin said, no, I'm going back to Basel to carry on with my writing. And then Farel basically said, God will curse your studies unless you respond to this call. And so Calvin was intimidated and joined Farel in Geneva. As you can see from the screen, he wasn't there for very long because they had a tussle with the city authorities over the question of the independence of the church, and the city authorities wanted to tell them exactly when and how they could have communion, and there was a row, and Farel and Calvin were both expelled. And Calvin was then called to the city of Strasbourg, which it's now a city in France, but it was part of Germany then, hence the German spelling there. And he was called to minister to the French congregation in Strasbourg. And he was called there by Martin Bucer, an older reformer who we'll be hearing more about in a minute, and who was a great influence on Calvin. And Calvin enjoyed his time in Strasbourg, but then things in Geneva went from bad to worse, and so they wanted Calvin to return. He was very reluctant, and he said he'd rather anything than to go back to the place where he'd be crucified daily. But eventually he accepted the call, went back to Geneva, and spent the rest of his life there. Initially, for most of his time there, he had many enemies, people who fought against what he did, and he had a big struggle. But in the final years, he prevailed. What made a big difference is lots of other French refugees came. They came because they liked Calvin, and the composition of the population changed, and various things happened to discredit his opponents. And so, but at the end of his life, the city was united behind him. Now, I've just got a few pictures I've taken from different places. This is the place in Noyon where Calvin was born. The actual house survives. It's probably been sort of altered a bit since his time, but that is the house where he was born. This is from Orléans University, a tiny remnant, you see just sort of stuck in there, a tiny remnant of the old university between some modern buildings. Not that much survives. That's a picture of Calvin the young man. So often the picture he's known by is as when he was a very elderly man in his 50s, because he aged very quickly, because things were different then. They didn't have the medical facilities we have today, and he worked himself to death pretty much. But there he is as a rather elegant young man. That is the city of Geneva from a diagram from the time of Calvin. At the top there you see St. Peter's Cathedral, one of the places where he preached, and the city wall around the city. There's a picture of Strasbourg, some of the older houses in the city of Strasbourg where Calvin spent some time. And that's the house, that house is where Martin Bucer lived, and Calvin would have spent a lot of time with him during his stay in Strasbourg. This is an authentic drawing made by a student during one of Calvin's lectures. And as some, of course it wouldn't happen tonight, but as occasionally happened, students' minds wander, and this one indulged himself in that picture. And you'll note behind Calvin, notice that arch. Well, this is the arch. That's there's a building right next to the cathedral, and it was at that spot where Calvin lectured. And in fact, that plaque on the wall there is saying that. So that is the actual spot where he was when that drawing was done. And this is the Academy in Geneva, an academic institution that was set up towards the end of Calvin's time, and which survives today as a sort of college for, I think it's college today for sort of 16 to 18-year-olds, that sort of thing, but it's still there. And that building on the right is from Calvin's time, from 1559. Yes, this is a rumour. You see somebody there being branded on the back. I'll be mentioning that in just a moment. Oh, finally, on my most recent trip to Geneva, there is that face peeping through there is mine. Big picture, just, a little fantasy of myself as Calvin. Okay, some distorted pictures. Calvin himself says in the preface to his final edition of his Institutes, "I think that there is no one who is assailed, bitten, and wounded by more false accusations than I." Well, he was a pretty astute prophet there, in that there have been plenty of such during his lifetime. He's a figure like, I think of a more recent figure, Margaret Thatcher. For some people, she is the greatest British Prime Minister since the war, or maybe in the 20th century. For other people, she is the ultimate, almost the devil incarnate. And Calvin, people's reactions to Calvin tend to be a bit similar. Jerome Balzac was somebody who a rather erratic figure. He became a Protestant, but he fell out with many other Protestants, Calvin and others, until eventually he went back to the Roman Catholic Church. And then in 1577, 13 years after Calvin's death, he wrote a thoroughly libelous Life of Calvin, which is avowedly based on rumours. I'll mention two of them. The rumour, first of all, he says that when Calvin was born, after he emerged from his mother's womb, he was followed by a swarm of flies. Well, says Balzac, I cannot vouch for this because I wasn't there, but he says, I'm sure it's true, nasty fly that he was. And then he also peddled a rumour that Calvin, during his time at Noyon, was accused and found guilty of homosexual activity and was branded on the back as a result of it. Well, neither of these two would have any rumours would have any credence today, but I mentioned a third one, and I remember a fellow student when I was first studying theology, a fellow student who was a Christian, asking me, he said, is it true that Calvin died in dark despair? And the answer is it's totally untrue, because we know he wrote a final address to the city council in Geneva, a final address to the pastors, firmly expressing his confidence in Christ and so on. It's completely untrue, but these rumours go around. Then in the 18th century, with the Enlightenment, Calvin and his whole approach fell very much out of favour. And Voltaire, the sceptical philosopher, who ironically spent some of his time in Geneva. Basically, when it was too hot for him in France, he went to Geneva, and when it was too hot in Geneva, he went to France, just across the border. And he associated Calvin with two ideas, with the burning of Servetus, the heretic, and quotes, we have Calvin killed Servetus, and he created a God who enjoys the damnation of most people. So Voltaire presented a very unsympathetic picture of Calvin. And then there's another one which is widely held today, and in fact it's even found in one much older but regarded as very respectable history of a dictionary of the history of the church, that Calvin was the dictator of Geneva. This is completely, well, I'm actually completely, but it's far wide of the mark. What he struggled for in Geneva was the independence of the church. He could never publish a single book without permission from the city council. Doesn't sound like a dictator to me. The city council complained if the sermons were too long. The reason why he left the first time was because of a row with the city council over exactly when they would take communion and how they would run it. So the city council controlled a lot of these things. Now, it is true that Calvin fought for a strict control of morals. One of his earlier things, which I find quite amusing, is that you weren't allowed to have a meal in an inn or tavern unless you said grace before and after the meal. Well, I can understand how they can enforce the before bit, you don't get your food unless you say grace, but how they ensured that people did it afterwards, I'm not sure. But that one got dropped. That was perhaps a step too far. So Calvin, it is true, he sought a very disciplined city, and I suppose to give you the other side, one of the city councillors was disciplined because he had danced at his daughter's wedding. So, and they had strict rules about what clothes you could wear, but that was not abnormal for that particular time. So that's one sort of distortion. Calvin, the dictator, the persecutor, and so on. Let me give you some other distortions. Calvin has been portrayed, especially in America perhaps, as a pioneer of democracy. Well, that one isn't completely wide of the mark. He felt the best form of government was a mixture of democracy and aristocracy. So relative to his time, he was more open for democracy, voting, and so on. But of course, it wouldn't be democracy in quite the sense as we have it today. But it is true, again, that if you look at the countries where democracy has grown, they have been mostly countries of a reform persuasion. Initially, at any rate, it was in these countries that democracy picked up. So there's an element of truth in that. This may seem amazing, a pioneer of tolerance. One of the things Calvin is known for is the burning of Servetus, who denied the Trinity, burning of him as a heretic. Now, the story's a bit more complicated than that, and we really haven't got time to go into that now, but the idea that Calvin was a pioneer of tolerance may seem like a little bit like a sick joke to some people, but certainly this picture of Calvin, especially just over 100 years ago, on the 400th anniversary of his birth, this sort of picture was being portrayed. And basically, what people have tended to do, people who like Calvin, they look in a mirror, they don't look back at the Calvin of history, they look in the mirror, they portray him as like themselves, and they say, wasn't he marvellous? And there's something we're perhaps all prone to do if we're not careful. And finally, the pioneer of capitalism, there has been the idea that Calvinism gave birth to capitalism. And again, it's far more complicated. And it's true that in reformed countries, that was an area where capitalism perhaps grew faster than others, but it's a bit more complex than that rather simplistic picture. Now, let's turn to the question now, which is perhaps of more immediate interest to many people. What is a Calvinist? I have been studying now, Calvin now, actually, just realized, a little over 47 years. And people have often in that time said to me, are you a Calvinist? And I don't answer that question because I don't know what they mean by Calvinist. So let me give you 5 possible meanings. And as one scholar put it very nicely, he said, if being a Calvinist means believing everything that Calvin believed, then there's only ever been one Calvinist in history, and he died in 1564. So that's not a very good definition. Then secondly, being Reformed as opposed to Lutheran. Basically, the Protestant Reformation began in two different places. It began with Luther in Wittenberg in 1517, we're hearing about, hence the anniversary this year, and another big anniversary 4 years later where Luther stood before the emperor and apparently, but probably didn't, said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And so in commemoration of that, I have come this evening wearing my Wittenberg socks with the words of Luther, "Here I stand, I can do no other," on them. So that's Luther, the Reformation in Germany. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, Zwingli, more or less at the same time, and fairly independently of Luther, also came up with the Reformation. And so you have these two branches, the Lutheran Reformation and the Reformed Swiss Reformation. And Calvin comes in the second category. Now, we'll look at this a little bit more in a moment, but what has happened is, for many people, the Reformed tradition has come to be known as Calvinism, although he wasn't there at the beginning. So, to be a Calvinist might simply mean to be a Protestant who is not a Lutheran, but Reformed. And that might embrace churches as diverse as Baptists, Methodists even, Presbyterians, and so on. Basically, Protestants whose heritage would go back to Zwingli and that side of the Reformation rather to Luther and that side. Then, as it was said in the introduction, it has a slightly narrower meaning. There might be churches that are avowedly Presbyterian or Reformed. Presbyterian tends to be the sort of the British term. English, Scottish, they talk about, have Presbyterian churches. On the continent, places like the Netherlands, they talk about Reformed churches. And so, of course, you have both in America, according to where people have come from. So, are you a Calvinist might mean, do you belong to a Presbyterian or Reformed church? But I suspect one or two here getting a bit impatient, saying, why doesn't he get to the real point? So, for other people, are you a Calvinist means basically, do you believe in predestination? And this goes back to a controversy within the Reformed Church at the beginning of the 17th century. Calvin, in line with all of the Reformers and in line with much of medieval history, and going back to Augustine, believed in predestination, that if I am a Christian, it is ultimately because God has chosen me. Arminius questioned that and said, no, it's the other way around. God chooses, putting it very crudely, God chooses me because he knows I will choose him. And then that controversy has led to a division ever since, and the Methodist churches, for instance, tend to be Wesleyan Arminian in reaction to the view of Calvin. So for many people, are you a Calvinist means, do you believe in predestination? But it's not a very good use of terminology, because Luther believed in predestination as strongly as Calvin, in fact a little bit stronger. And many, not all medieval theologians, but certainly a large proportion, a significant proportion, believed in predestination. Augustine taught it. So really, if you want to say, do you believe in predestination, it might be better to say, are you an Augustinian, rather than a Calvinist. But then finally, we have what is known as TULIP. Who here has heard of TULIP? Yes, quite a few people. TULIP is an acronym for the so-called 5 points of Calvinism. So let's turn our attention now to TULIP. First of all, I just want to quickly run through for you what the 5 points refer to. So T refers to total depravity. The doctrine, not that we're all as bad as we could be, but that every aspect of human nature is affected by the fall and by sin. U is unconditional election. God chooses us, and if God chooses us, it's not because of anything we have done or are going to do, it's God's unconditional choice. Limited atonement is the doctrine that Christ died intentionally to save the elect, not died for the whole of the human race. I is irresistible grace, that when God sets out to get you, he will get you. You cannot resist his grace. P is the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints. those who are truly converted, God will keep to the end. Now, TULIP does not go back to Calvin. It actually originated in the 20th century, early 20th century. However, the 5 points that make it up do go back much further. So it's not that the very ideas originated in the 20th century, but the acronym TULIP began in 20th century America. So let's ask ourselves the question, was Calvin a Calvinist, if that's what Calvinist means? And basically, TULIP is not an accurate portrayal of Calvin. Let's go through the 5 points. Yes, basically Calvin believed in total depravity. I think the wording is unfortunate because it can easily be understood to mean that we're as bad as we could possibly be, but as I say, that's not what it means. But it does mean that the whole of human nature is radically affected by sin. Unconditional election, yes, he believed in that, as did all the other reformers, and it goes back to Augustine. Limited atonement. That was not a controversy in Calvin's time, and Calvin doesn't actually give a clear answer to that, but I would hold, and I think probably the majority of those who look at Calvin would hold, that he did not believe in that. And so in his Institutes at one point, he talks about the death of Christ and so on, and then he starts another book of the Institutes, and he says, what Christ has done for the whole human race is useless until the Holy Spirit applies it to us. So what Christ has done for the whole human race is applied by the Holy Spirit to the elect. So it seems to me, I think I would argue, and along with many others, that Calvin did not agree with that particular one. Irresistible grace. I think that's an extremely unfortunate phraseology, and it's not one that Calvin used, or Augustine. And let me explain why I think it's unfortunate. Because it's very ambiguous. Consider this phrase. If a girl were to say, I couldn't resist him. Now that could mean two different things. It could mean I fell madly in love with him, or it could be a statement made in a law court where he's on trial for rape. And I think the idea of irresistible is an unfortunate one. The term irresistible, because it's so ambiguous, can easily imply violence. And that's why Augustine and Calvin preferred to talk of grace as efficacious, as effective. It reminds me, actually, I can't resist this, the story of the man who was walking by the seaside and a bottle floated to shore, and he opened the bottle, and in it was a thing saying, you have 3 wishes. So he said, great, I'd love to have a villa by the side of a Swiss lake. So bang, there he was, he found himself in this villa. And then a few days later, the bills started coming in, and he wasn't very wealthy, so he said, I'd love to have a numbered Swiss bank account with a vast amount of money in it. And next moment he knew he had it. And then finally, a few days later, he felt he was rather lonely. So he said, I want to become irresistible to women. And at that point, he turned into a box of chocolates. So the word irresistible has a variety of meanings. Finally, perseverance of the saints. Yes, Calvin believed that for the elect who have truly been converted, God will keep them to the end. This is not a doctrine of once saved, always saved, in the sense that once you have become a Christian, it doesn't matter how you live because you'll be saved anyway. It's not that. You need to persevere to the end to be saved, as the New Testament says, but if you have been truly converted, if God has begun that work into you, he will make sure that you do persevere to the end. So, TULIP is a not completely picture-accurate portrayal of Calvin. So we have Calvin versus the Calvinists, and there are many people who have tried to bring out a contrast between them. When Calvin died, his place was taken by his lieutenant, his right-hand man, a man called Beza, and there are people who have accused Beza of changing Calvin's theology in a significant way. And then, for many especially Presbyterians, their doctrine comes from the Westminster Confession of Faith, written in the 17th century in England, at the Palace of Westminster in London. And people have drawn the contrast between Calvin and the Westminster Confession. And so just to mention briefly, predestination. Beza and the Westminster Confession are accused of giving it a greater prominence than Calvin did. It may come as a surprise to some to know that people could give it a greater prominence than Calvin, but certainly that accusation has been made. Limited atonement, I've already mentioned this. This is a later development, and one which I think actually is contrary to what Calvin says. And then assurance of salvation. The Westminster Confession says that assurance is something that you can have as a believer, but it may take many years to get it. Whereas Calvin's view was that saving faith itself includes the idea of assurance. So is assurance, if you like, part of the package? Is it something that you get when you become a Christian? Or is it something you have to seek and may take many years to get? And so there's a clear difference between those two. And so there's the idea come in that these later groups, like the Westminster Confession, like Beza, somehow betrayed Calvin. And I think there's a fallacy behind this, a fallacy in the understanding of how Calvin relates to Calvinism. So let me give you two possible views. For some, Calvin is the founder of Calvinism, so you have Calvin, a straight line leading to Calvinism. Whereas others would say, no, Calvinism has betrayed Calvin, so we see the line going off in a distorted way. But neither of these views is correct. They're both based on a false premise of how Calvin relates to the Reformed tradition. And the first generation of reformers, the ones who were there from by the year 1520, would include Luther and Melanchthon on the Lutheran side, and Zwingli, who started the Reformation in Switzerland, Bucer, who on the whole allied himself with Zwingli. Both of these, all four of these, were active by 1520. And Calvin is just one of many second-generation reformers. So Calvin is on the Reformed side with Zwingli and Bucer, and he is just one of many later second-generation reformers. So these first people were active in 1520. We don't know exactly when Calvin was converted, but 1530s, definitely. However, as time goes on, Calvin became increasingly prominent, partly because he expressed himself so clearly and lucidly, and his ideas became seen as very attractive, and so eventually the Reformed tradition was called Calvinism. Initially that was a term of abuse by its opponents, but eventually it became taken up, and so many people would refer to the Reformed tradition as Calvinism. So Calvin was not the founder of the Reformed tradition. Calvin was a second-generation reformer. And there isn't the question, people like the Westminster Confession, whether they're betraying Calvin. No question of that. They were not intending. They were not followers of Calvin. They were people in the Reformed tradition who were seeking to be faithful to Scripture. And if they disagree with Calvin, it's not because they were betraying him. They never pretended that they were his disciples in the first place, except, they admired him and so on, but they didn't regard him as infallible. He wasn't like Scripture. So the whole idea of betrayal is missing the point. And here I'd just like to sort of give a warning against the distortions of Calvin. Calvin has been distorted on the one hand by Calvinists who have tried to read later Calvinist ideas back into Calvin. On the other hand, Barthians, followers of Karl Barth, have tried to introduce different doctrines and to try and foist them back onto Calvin. Barth himself, who died in 1968, was very critical of people who did that, but there are people around who have written on Calvin who have an axe to grind. So the important thing, I think, is simply to to look at Calvin and to listen to him on his own terms. I belonged to a study group some years ago, and we were discussing things across the history of theology, and we had a couple of years we looked at this Calvin and Calvinism thing, and there was an elderly Scottish professor at the event, and at one point he moved from talking about Calvin to expressing his own views. And somebody objected, say, hang on, are we talking about Calvin here or what? And he said, in a sort of artless way, he said, we're all just using Calvin to push forward our own ideas. And the room erupted, because it was like the little boy saying, the emperor's wearing no clothes. It was so obviously true that this is what people were doing. Well, I'm more interested in knowing what Calvin actually taught. And if I agree with him, that's fine. If I don't agree with him, well, I don't have to pretend he said something different. So let me put this in a diagrammatic form and just get all these things up. It's not Calvin leading to Calvinism, but the Reformed tradition beginning with Zwingli and Bucer, who were among the earliest ones, and then there were later figures like Calvin, Bullinger, who followed Zwingli in Zurich, Peter Martyr, who was an Italian important figure, Wolfgang Muskilus, another important figure. And all of these gave birth to what is known as the Reformed tradition, and also today, sometimes known as Calvinism. So if the Westminster Confession has a different view of assurance from Calvin, it's not because they betrayed Calvin, it's because the Westminster Confession was very influenced, as the English Puritan tradition was, by Bullinger. So Bullinger, contemporary of Calvin's, taught a different view of assurance from Calvin. It's that view that works its way through into the Westminster Confession. It's not that they all began with the teaching of Calvin and some were faithful and some were not, but this was a broad tradition, and all of these people held slightly different views. They're basically the same Reformed tradition, but they all had their distinctive features. And the ones who differed, or those later on who differ from what Calvin originally taught, as I say, it's not they're betraying Calvin, it's just they belong to a different part of that stream. Now, some of us are going to be spending some time looking at Calvin's Institutes in the next few days, and so I want to just give a quick rundown of how that came into being. And it was not born as an adult, but is something that developed and grew over about 25 years. So the first edition came out in 1536. It was a pocket book. It was about, it was 85,000 words. So if you think of Matthew, New Testament, Matthew to Ephesians, that sort of length. And then in 1539, he revised it, and you can see now it's much larger, over twice as large. Whereas the first one had 6 chapters, this one had 17 chapters, thoroughly rewritten. Then in 1543, the 17 chapters became 21. And mostly now not rewriting things, but just adding more material. Then 1550, you see, it's not very much bigger, but now for the first time it's divided into chapters and sections. So each chapter has a number of subsections, if you like. And then finally, 1559, he says, now at last I was satisfied with it. And it's a lot bigger, and it's divided into 4 books, each on different themes, and a total of 80 chapters, so average of 20 books a chapter, and then different sections. So you might have, for instance, 1, 5, 13, which means book 1, chapter 5, section 13. And a typical section might be about, well, it could be anything from 1 page to 4 or 5 pages. Now, Calvin also himself translated it into French. Others of his books were translated by other people, but he took particular concern to do this, because he wanted to reach out to the French population. Calvin was not Swiss. As I said, he was born in France. He never actually lived in Switzerland, except when he was in Basel, because Geneva only became part of Switzerland under Napoleon. So it was an independent city-state. But as I say, he came from France. He had a passion for France, and so he translated this so ordinary lay people who weren't expert in Latin could read it. And this was an amazing thing to do, because up until that time, you didn't use French for serious ideas. Serious ideas are written in Latin. You might write popular stories in French. And a lot of the people well, in France, people who study Calvin mostly are in the literature departments in the universities, partly because they don't have France being so secular, they don't have theology departments, but because Calvin is very important, one of the most important figures for the origins of the modern French language. Just as Luther is very important for the origin of German with the Luther Bible. So Calvin is significant in that way for the French language. And they were translated by himself, each of these editions, because he wanted it to reach people in France. Well, he didn't translate it into English, but other people have. And in the 16th century, Thomas Norton, who was a son-in-law of Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, reformer, he translated it. And I heard Jim Packer on one occasion saying he thought that was the best translation, actually. But he's a classic scholar, which I'm not, so I'll take his word for it. In the 19th century, you have a couple of other translations by Allen and by Beveridge. And the Beveridge one you can buy cheap copies of, but you need a magnifying glass to read it because everything's very compressed. And then Battles translated it in 1960, and that's the best one to use, not because it's necessarily the best translation, they all have their pluses and minuses, but because it's nicely laid out, it's got very helpful footnotes, it's got appendixes and indexes and so on. So as a sort of study version, it has a lot to be commended in it. Okay, so why did Calvin write the Institutes? There's more than one aim, and this aim changes. In 1536, he describes it in the title page as a sum of piety. Not a sum of doctrine, but a sum of piety, of godly living. And it's modelled on a catechism. The four traditional aspects of a catechism were the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the two sacraments. And we have chapters on each of those. That's 4 chapters. And then there are a couple more chapters, one on the 4th sacraments, that's an attack on Roman Catholic view of the sacraments, and another one on government, how church and state should be governed. And then, after he'd written it, the King of France instigated a persecution of Protestant Christians in France, and Calvin wrote a dedication to the King of France saying, this is an apology, I'm explaining what we believe. We don't believe these awful things we're accused of. This is what we believe. So a catechism and an apology, not in the sense of apologizing, but in the sense of a defense. But then in 1539, we have a rather different aim, a companion to the commentaries. And what Calvin says there is, if I write a commentary, I don't have to have long digressions in the commentary explaining doctrine. That's a little dig at Martin Bucer, who wrote an unbelievably long commentary on Romans, because he kept on putting in excursus on this or that doctrine. So if I write a commentary, he says, then I don't need to be doing that, because I can refer you to the Institutes. And also, by implication, in the Institutes, if Calvin puts a little note saying Romans 5:12, he's turning you to Paul, but he's also saying, look at my commentary on Romans 5:12. So the two complement each other, the commentaries and the Institutes. He also says it's to be seen as a summary of Christian doctrine. So the sum of piety, if you like, has become a bit more heavyweight now, a sum of Christian doctrine. And also, he says, he's written it to help prepare people for ministry. Well, finally, I'll be glad to know our final aspect, Calvin's relationship to Scripture. I showed you the picture earlier on of the academy that Calvin built in Geneva, which was finished in 1559, founded that year, and Calvin taught in the academy. Can anybody tell me what he taught in the academy? Anybody? No? Anyone like to guess? What do you think he taught in the academy? The Bible. Yes. I'm not quite sure what's meant by that, in the sense that all, his teaching was biblically based. But anyway, what he didn't teach, he did not give lectures on theology, on doctrine. In fact, he taught the Old Testament. So his lectures that he gave are on books of the Old Testament. And so this takes away this myth that Calvin, it's occasionally been said Calvin was a man of one book, the Institutes. That could not be more wrong. He spent more time writing commentaries and preaching sermons than he did doing preparing the Institutes. And Calvin is, I would say, unique in the history of the church. If you were to draw up a list of the top 10 theologians of the church, well, everybody's list would be different, but for a lot of people, not just people who think of themselves as being reformed, but a large number of people would recognize that Calvin would be among the top 10 theologians in the history of the church. But if you were to draw a list of the top 10 exegetes in the history of the church, Calvin would have a very strong claim to be up there. I was in another institution from Singapore, which I probably shouldn't mention in time that's been paid for by BGST, but this morning, and we're chatting with some of the lecturers there and made this point, and they said yes, and we agreed. People today read the commentaries, a few people, commentaries of Augustine or Luther or Karl Barth. Why do they read them? Because they want to understand Augustine, Luther, Karl Barth. If you want to understand Romans, don't go to Barth's commentary on Romans. Don't go to Luther's commentary on Romans. And people generally don't. But people read Calvin today because they want to better understand Paul or Micah. And you can go to solid academic commentaries on a book like Micah or a book like Romans, and there's a good chance that it'll quote and engage with Calvin. Not from his point of view as theology, but Calvin as an exegete, Calvin as a very faithful reader of the text. So I think Calvin is the only person, I can't think of any counterexample, the only person who has a really solid claim to be in the top 10 in both of those areas. And that says a lot about his the way in which he read Scripture. Well, we have his commentaries and lectures. He wrote commentaries on almost the entire New Testament. He didn't get to Revelation. And for some reason, I just cannot understand, he never did 2 and 3 John. Because at the rate he worked, it would have been an afternoon's work. I really don't understand why. It's certainly not because he didn't see, he certainly saw them as canonical, but for some strange reason, he never got to them. For the Old Testament, we have a few commentaries, but a lot of what is known as Calvin's work on the Old Testament is his lectures. So the Minor Prophets, for instance, these are books on which he lectured, and if you sometimes it would be called Calvin's commentary on, say, Micah, but it's actually his lectures, a verbatim text of his lectures. And it contains things like, which you don't normally find in a commentary, like, oh dear, the bell's going now, we'll pick up this next time. So it was literally a transcript of his lectures. So commentaries and lectures. Calvin also preached. He preached about 200 times each year, spread unevenly, and many of his sermons were recorded, written down, transcript, although by rather bizarre history, a number of these were sold off by weight in the early 19th century, and a few of them have been recovered, but we have quite a lot of Calvin's sermons, which cover some books on which he didn't write commentaries. So finally, Calvin the exegete. Calvin is particularly, people with knowing Calvin's reputation might think, oh, here's somebody who's constantly twisting it to say what he wants. Far from it. So just to give you one example, how much do the Old Testament Psalms talk about Jesus? And most Christian exegetes in the 16th century would see a lot of references to Christ in the Psalms. Calvin sees very few, about as few as anybody would, because he says, it's a nice idea, but that's not what the text says. He really did pay very careful attention to what the text said. Not that that makes him infallible, not that that prevents him from getting it wrong sometimes, but as an exegete he was extremely careful.